Since the day we met, Elaine had always been the heart of our small family. Her lively energy had a way of putting everyone around her at ease. From the moment we crossed paths at a mutual friend's party, I was captivated by her. 19 years later, not much had changed. My career as a police officer had taken its toll on me, but Elaine always knew how to lift the burden from my shoulders, often without even realizing it. She wasn't just my wife, she was my closest confidant, someone who always saw the best in others and in me. Retirement had been a mixed experience for me. As I transitioned from the fast pace of police work to a more stable life as a contractor, Elaine continued her demanding role as an executive assistant at Betrayal International. I took comfort in our routine, raising our son Tommy and taking a more hands-on role in managing the household. But that evening, things began to feel different in a way I wasn't prepared for. It was approaching 5:30 p.m., and my wife of nearly 20 years hadn't returned home from work or contacted me. Normally, she would arrive shortly after 4 p.m., since her job with Betrayal International started early and finished mid-afternoon. Ever since Michael, her former boss, had passed away 2 years ago, his daughter Janice had taken over the company and kept Elaine as her trusted assistant. Tommy had already come home from school and was upstairs hurrying through his homework so he could watch TV later. By 5:45 p.m., I was getting concerned and decided to call Elaine's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Just as I finished leaving her a message, she walked in carrying several bags from Antonio's Italian restaurant. She greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek as she headed to the kitchen. "Sorry, honey," she said. "I had to stay late and didn't take anything out of the freezer, so I picked up something from Antonio's. Hope that's okay." "Sure," I replied, though I was still worried. "Why didn't you call?" "I forgot to charge my phone last night," she explained. "When I got to the car to call you, it was dead." One of my few pet peeves with Elaine was that her phone was often either dead, off, or on silent, making it hard to reach her when she was out. Whenever I complained, she'd say, "You're right, Joe. I'll do better." She'd remember for a few days, but then things would go back to the usual. It was frustrating, but I'd learned to live with it. Elaine was in a great mood during dinner, though most of the conversation was led by our 7th-grade son, who was excited about his upcoming baseball trials and annoyed by how much homework his math teacher, Miss Fielding, had assigned. We always let Tommy watch TV until his 9 p.m. bedtime, but we had decided long ago that he wouldn't have a television in his room, something he frequently complained about. We didn't have a TV in our bedroom either, preferring not to be distracted from sleep or intimacy, which we managed to maintain at least 4 times a week. Something unusual among our friends and neighbors, most of whom seemed glued to their screens. Some even had TVs in their kitchens. To give you some context, I'm Joe Sullivan. My wife Elaine and I have always been a bit unconventional. I retired last year at 50 as a patrol sergeant with the county police department, thanks to a state retirement system that allows military veterans to buy back their service time. This let me count my 4 years as an Army Ranger toward my 25-year police retirement. In short, I, along with other veterans, paid into the system the amount the county would have contributed, allowing that time to count toward my retirement. The physical demands of police work combined with my part-time handyman job left my 5'9" frame with very little body fat. Since retiring, I turned my side job into a full-time contracting business with the connections I'd made over the years through small home improvement projects. I didn't need to advertise, word of mouth kept me busy with more than enough clients. Elaine, who will turn 45 next month, was 25 when we got married, and I had just turned 31 and started my police career. The details of how we met aren't important, but suffice it to say, I was instantly smitten when we met at a friend's party. Elaine still has the same shoulder-length wavy brown hair, blue eyes, and radiant smile she had back then. At 5'5", she's still a size 8. Beyond her looks, it was her vibrant personality that truly captivated me. While she can be a bit naive about people's motives, which might be my cynicism after years in law enforcement, she's always been my rock. As an executive assistant at a mid-sized international company, she earns a good salary, and together with my increased income from contracting, we're financially secure. We've always been best friends, respecting each other, and our marriage has been a true partnership. We share responsibilities, including parenting, cooking, and housework. Of course, some chores are divided along traditional lines. Elaine avoids yard work, and I steer clear of her laundry room. I learned that lesson the hard way after ruining a few of her blouses by mixing colors. After dinner, Tommy headed to the living room to watch TV, and I helped Elaine clear the table and load the dishwasher. Normally, after cleaning up the kitchen, we'd have coffee before settling into the den to talk or read. Tonight was no different. As Elaine set a cup of coffee in front of me, she mentioned casually, "Connie got promoted to head the London office. If it's okay with you, we're planning to go out to dinner and maybe dance a little tomorrow night." To be honest, I didn't really keep track of Elaine's work friends, so I couldn't remember who Connie was, but I didn't want to seem uninterested, so I just nodded. The dancing part caught my attention. "You'll just be dancing together?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Of course," she replied casually. "It'll only be for a few hours, and I'll be back by 11. I wasn't thrilled with the idea, but since she rarely went out with her friends, unlike many of the other wives we knew, I agreed. The next evening, after getting home from work, I asked Joe what he had planned for dinner for himself and Tommy. "Chicken pot pies," he replied confidently. I frowned. I couldn't stand pot pies, always reminding Joe of their high sodium and calorie content, but seeing how pleased he looked, I just shook my head and said, "Connie's picking me up at 7, so I'm going to shower and change while you two poison yourselves." At 6:50 p.m., the doorbell rang. From upstairs, I assumed it was Connie, but I heard Joe answer the door. Expecting to hear Elaine's friend, I was surprised when Joe opened the door to see a well-dressed man in his mid-30s, tall with wavy blonde hair. My first thought was that he might be a salesman or worse, a Jehovah's Witness, but then I remembered Jehovah's Witnesses usually come in pairs. He quickly dispelled those ideas by extending his hand and saying, "Hi, you must be Joe. Elaine talks about you all the time." As I reluctantly shook his hand, he stepped into the house. Sensing my confusion, he smiled brightly and added, "Oh, maybe you don't remember me. We met briefly at the office Christmas party. I'm Conrad Hunter. I just wanted to thank you for letting me take Elaine out tonight. I guess she mentioned that I'm leaving next week to head our London office. Your wife has been such a great help to me these past 2 years, and I wanted to show my appreciation." He rattled off the words quickly, but there was something in his tone, a slight sense of superiority that rubbed me the wrong way. Finally, I gathered my wits and responded, "Well, Conrad, I think." He interrupted cheerfully, "Please call me Connie. Everyone does." That was all I needed to hear. I put the pieces together and, more firmly this time, said, "Well, Connie, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Give me a moment to talk to my wife." I hurried upstairs, trying to keep my cool. When Joe entered our bedroom, I had just finished adjusting my dress and was checking my reflection in the full-length mirror. I was wearing a black cocktail dress, elegant but not overly conservative. I picked up my red leather clutch, which matched my 4-inch red heels, and turned to Joe with a smile. "That must be Connie. How do I look?" Joe didn't respond immediately, but the anger and disbelief on his face made me pause. "What's wrong, Joe? You look upset," I asked cautiously. "Upset?" he yelled. "My wife is going out with some young guy who's trying to make me look like an idiot. So no, I'm not just upset. I'm shocked, furious, and humiliated that there's a man downstairs in my house waiting to take my wife out for what he thinks is a romantic evening. And unless he's gay, his goal is to get you into bed." I crossed my arms, feeling the heat of my own anger rising. I could tell this conversation wasn't going to end well. From the silence that followed, I knew she was calming herself, preparing for a verbal battle. When she finally spoke, Her voice was filled with a level of anger I'd never heard before. Well, Joe, I'm the one who's shocked and furious. First, you've practically accused me of letting another man seduce me. Your accusation is not only offensive but also deeply hurtful. Second, I've worked with Connie for 2 years, and he's always been nothing but a gentleman. He has never made a move or said anything inappropriate. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. I'm not going to leave him standing there while you embarrass yourself. I'll be home around 11, and hopefully, by then, you'll have pulled your head out of your backside. I stood there in shock as she walked downstairs. I couldn't remember ever being this angry. Our marriage had always been built on love and trust, and I couldn't believe that my husband of 19 years was implying such a thing. It felt like the trust and respect I thought we shared only went one way. Connie must have sensed that something was wrong when I kissed him on the cheek because he asked, "Is everything all right?" Forcing a smile, I replied, "Absolutely, ready to go." I glanced back up the stairs as Connie gently placed his hand on my back, leading me out the door. From the top of the stairs, I watched as my wife kissed her date on the cheek. She looked up briefly, and I could have sworn I saw a smirk on her face. He then wrapped his arm around her waist and guided her out. The anger boiling inside me wasn't just directed at Elaine but also at myself for not doing more to stop her from going. By allowing this, she was disrespecting our marriage and jeopardizing our relationship. Looking back to when she told me about her plans to have dinner and dance with a colleague, I now realized she had deliberately avoided using any words like he or him, always only referring to Connie. It seemed too deliberate, as though she was intentionally trying to mislead me. Surely, she didn't expect me to recall a brief introduction from nearly a year ago at a crowded office party. Meanwhile, in the car with Conrad, I was distracted, barely paying attention to the small talk he was making. I was still upset with Joe, and it took a while before I realized Conrad had asked me something. "What do you think?" he repeated. "Oh, sorry," I said, shaking myself out of my thoughts. "What did you say?" "No worries," he replied. "I was just asking what you thought about having dinner at the Chop House. It's in the Marriott, and there's a great dance club there." Pushing aside the argument I just had with Joe, I responded, "That sounds lovely. I've never been but I've heard good things." Connie gave me a curious look and, while reaching over to gently squeeze my hand, asked, "Are you sure everything's okay? You seemed upset when you came downstairs, and from my short interaction with your husband, I got the feeling he wasn't exactly thrilled about our evening." I noticed his use of hun and the word date, along with the hand squeeze, but it didn't bother me. After all, I'd known him for 2 years, and plenty of men call their female friends hun. As for calling it a date, in a loose sense, I suppose it was, just not the way Joe was interpreting it. "You're right," I admitted. "I assumed Joe would remember you from the party, especially since he had innocently asked later who I was dancing with. Thinking back, maybe I said Conrad instead of Connie, but I honestly don't recall. I guess when he realized Connie wasn't the girlfriend he expected, he got the wrong impression." "Listen, Con said kindly, if you want to change your mind about tonight, I completely understand. I'd be disappointed, though, not just because you look stunning but because I was really looking forward to spending a few hours on the dance floor with you." "Absolutely not," I responded, perhaps more firmly than intended. "I'm looking forward to a nice dinner and watching you show off your dance moves. You really are quite the dancer, and I have to admit, Joe has 2 left feet. He barely manages to get through the couple of obligatory dances when we go out." Not wanting to offend, I added with a playful smile and a teasing tone, "But remember, I'm a married woman, and I'll be home by midnight. I'm all yours until then." I remembered telling Joe I'd be home by 11, but after he irritated me, I decided to push it to midnight. Connie flashed his charming grin and, with a quick touch to my knee, said, "Great, let's just enjoy the evening, and I'll make sure to have Cinderella home before the clock strikes 12. Back home, Tommy and I sat down to our pot pies, but for the first time, I couldn't enjoy mine. Tommy asked when his mom would be home, and since I'd already told him she was out with a girlfriend, I saw no reason to admit that his clueless father had allowed her to go on what I now considered a date with another man. That's exactly how I saw it, me, the naive fool. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Tommy's bedtime on weekends was usually extended to 10 p.m., but I wasn't in the mood to sit alone and stew over my frustration while waiting for my wife to return, so I let him stay up until 11. After sending him off to bed with a hug, he was too old for a kiss now. Finding it embarrassing, I planted myself in the living room, staring at the muted TV, listening for the sound of a car in the driveway. My anger continued to build, and I was set on confronting Elaine when she got home. While I was sure their relationship was professional, no wife of mine should be out dining and dancing with another man. I trusted Elaine despite my earlier words, but I had no faith in the man she was with. Maybe it was my instincts as a cop or the jealous husband in me, but his polished gentleman act wasn't fooling me. I saw the predator lurking beneath the surface, and I just hoped my Red Riding Hood wouldn't be fooled by the wolf in sheep's clothing. At 11:30 p.m., I resisted the urge to call her, but by 11:45 p.m., I couldn't help myself any longer. I knew her return time had likely shifted from 11 to sometime around midnight, but I still expected her to answer and say she was on her way. Once again, the call went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. The fact that her phone was off only fueled my anger further. We had a great dinner at the Chop House. I started with a couple of Cosmos, and Connie had a few beers. I won't lie, I wasn't immune to his compliments. He kept telling me how lucky Joe was to have such a beautiful, charming, and sexy wife. When my age came up, he flattered me further by saying he thought I had married an older man and that I didn't look a day over 35. Flattery works wonders on a woman, and I was no exception. I'd all but forgotten my earlier argument with Joe and was eager to hit the dance floor with Connie. The band was incredible, and we danced non-stop for almost an hour. We only took a break when a slow song came on, and I slyly led us off the floor. After the band paused, I excused myself to use the restroom. When I returned, Connie had a fresh Cosmo waiting for me and another beer for himself. I was still thirsty from all the dancing and probably drank it quicker than usual. When the music started up again, we returned to the floor, but I soon felt lightheaded. A few songs in, another slow number came on, and I didn't resist when Connie pulled me close. When another slow song followed, I was grateful to hold on to him, feeling unsteady from the effects of the drink. Noticing my discomfort, Connie suggested we take a break. I barely noticed when his hand rested on my lower back as he guided me to our booth. This time, he sat beside me instead of across from me like before. By 1 a.m., I had called Elaine's phone 5 times and left 3 messages. The last one was clear in its frustration. Elaine, if this is about punishing me, I get it. But I expect you to call me back immediately. If I don't hear from you in the next half hour, I'm locking the door, and you can spend the night with your lover, knowing you've destroyed a great marriage and a happy family. I was beyond furious, and my mind was spinning out of control. 1:30 came and went, but I didn't go to bed. I stayed in the living room, questioning whether I'd still have a marriage by morning. I felt Connie's hand move from mine and slowly grazed the inside of my thigh. Despite feeling the tension and a mix of emotions, I was too dazed to push him away. I felt myself growing aroused but couldn't gather the strength to speak. The alcohol had impaired my ability to think clearly, and I felt embarrassed for getting this drunk. Part of me knew I should stop him, but another part didn't want to. At some point, I vaguely recall hearing a voice speaking to me and feeling a strong arm helping me out of the booth. "You don't look well, honey," I heard him say. "I think you should lie down." He led me somewhere, his arm supporting me. I remember entering a room I didn't recognize, where there was a bed. I wasn't particularly tired, but my body felt detached from my mind. I heard faint, unintelligible words before Connie's lips pressed against mine. Before long, I felt the cool air against my bare skin and saw my clothes in a heap on the floor. He climbed on top of me and took me. My eyes instinctively shut, and when I managed to open them slightly, I saw a face staring back at me with blue eyes, definitely not Joe's. My mind screamed, not Joe, not Joe, but my body betrayed me, trembling as I reached a powerful climax. Meanwhile, I was in a full-blown panic by 5 a.m., after making several more unanswered calls. I finally collapsed onto my bed, falling into an exhausted, restless sleep. I was convinced our marriage was over. Short of something catastrophic happening, there was no excuse I would accept and no way to forgive her for this blatant betrayal. Just after 7 a.m., my phone rang. Thinking it was Elaine, I hesitated to answer, convinced there was nothing she could say that would undo the damage she'd caused. When I looked at the caller ID, I didn't recognize the number. Hesitantly, I hit the answer button, still half asleep, and said, "Hello." The voice on the other end asked, "Is this Joe Sullivan?" As I confirmed it was, a sick feeling churned in my stomach, fearing this call was about that catastrophic event I had brushed off earlier. "Joe, this is Terry Connor. Do you remember me?" Terry had been one of the newer patrol officers I supervised before I retired. He was a former Marine and a sharp cop, more street-smart than some of the others who hadn't served in the military. "Of course, Terry," I replied, my anxiety obvious in my voice. "What's going on?" He hesitated before asking, "Is your wife home?" A wave of dread hit me as I responded, "No, she went out to dinner with a colleague and was supposed to be back by 11 p.m. last night. I haven't been able to reach her. Every call has gone to voicemail." "Is she okay?" "Yes and no," Terry said. "Joe, she's at Mercy Hospital. She came to the ER on her own, reporting she had been sexually assaulted." I responded to the call, but all she would say was her name and that her husband was a former cop. "She refused to speak to anyone except you. There are no visible injuries, but they're running blood tests and conducting a sexual assault exam. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but you need to get here as soon as possible. I'll have to call the detectives, but I wanted to give you a heads up first." "How soon can you make it here?" 15 minutes, I answered abruptly. "Okay, Joe. Normally, I'd return to patrol when the detectives arrive, but I'll hang around a bit so you can get here before they do." "Thanks, Terry," I said sincerely. "I'll be there as fast as I can." My first thought was, I'm going to kill that bastard. I didn't want to wake Tommy, but I also couldn't leave him to wake up alone in an empty house, confused. I went to his room and gently shook him awake, saying, "Hey, son, wake up." He rubbed his eyes, still disoriented, but I spoke quickly, knowing I had little time. "Tommy, your mom was in a minor car accident. She's okay, but they're checking her out at the hospital just to be safe. I need to head down there with the insurance info. I didn't want you to wake up and find the house empty. Like I said, she's fine, no cuts or broken bones, so don't worry. Go back to sleep, and I'll be home soon." Though concerned, he mumbled, "Okay, Dad," and lay back down. My hands were shaking so badly that I struggled to get the key into the ignition. When I woke up, I urgently needed to use the bathroom, but I was still groggy and confused. The room was dark except for the faint light coming from the bathroom. As I slipped out of bed and made my way toward the light, my mind began to clear, and I realized I wasn't at home. Sitting on the toilet, I realized it wasn't just the need to pee that had woken me, it was the pain in my backside. When I wiped, I saw traces of blood on the toilet paper, and that's when it hit me what had happened. As I sat there, flashes of the previous night came flooding back, and the realization of what I had endured made me feel sick. I started gagging and barely had time to turn and collapse to the floor before I began vomiting. Once my stomach was empty, I leaned against the bathroom vanity, staring at a woman in the mirror I barely recognized. My eyes were bloodshot, there were bite marks on my neck and shoulder, and my hair was matted in places with what could only be drying semen. Shame and guilt washed over me like a tidal wave, threatening to drown me. I couldn't bear to look at the woman in the mirror any longer. She wasn't the confident, happy wife and loving mother I was supposed to be. Still leaning on the counter, my head hung low as tears began to fall. When I finally forced myself to look up again, I realized how my foolish naivety and stubbornness had cost me my dignity, my husband's trust, and possibly my son's respect. If I had a weapon, I would have killed the monster who had destroyed my life for his own selfish gain. How could I have gotten this drunk? I thought to myself. But as I replayed the night, I realized I had only had 3 drinks at the restaurant and 1 at the club. That might give me a slight buzz, but it wasn't enough to make me lose control like I had. He drugged me, I said aloud. That disgusting creep must have spiked my drink. I knew what I wanted to do when I saw him still asleep, lying naked on his back. I imagined clawing his eyes out, ripping his genitals off, or biting him. But I knew I didn't have the strength. Instead, I knew what I had to do. Moving quietly, I got dressed and, with one last look of pure hatred at the man I once admired, slipped out of the room. It took me about 15 minutes to reach the emergency room, and as promised, Terry was waiting for me. The waiting room was nearly deserted at this early hour. "Where is she?" I demanded as I made my way toward the curtained-off areas. Terry immediately stopped me, placing a firm hand on my chest. "Hold on, Joe. She's asleep." They gave her a sedative to calm her down. She was pretty hysterical. "The detectives will be here soon. Take a moment to collect your thoughts and get your story straight." "What are you talking about?" I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "Listen, Joe," Terry said, still looking every bit like the Marine he once was, guiding me to a quiet corner away from prying ears. Though he was 15 years younger and stronger, his voice remained calm as he said, "I'm on your side. I don't know the details of your marriage, and I don't need to. What I do know is that at 4:15 this morning, your wife came here in a cab, claiming she was attacked. The detectives will want to know where you were, why she wasn't home with her family, who she was with, and why she showed up here dressed for a night out. She refused to answer any of my questions, insisting she'd only talk to you. Out of respect for you, I didn't push her, but the detectives will. I'm just saying, be prepared to minimize any fallout for your family." Before I could thank Terry, 2 things happened simultaneously. The detectives arrived, and the ER doctor approached us. One of the detectives was a man I recognized immediately, Harvey Berg, a veteran cop with 30 years on the force. The other was a woman I didn't know. As the doctor walked up, Harvey paused, letting the female detective move forward while he whispered something to her. Though she seemed irritated, she stepped aside. The doctor, speaking with a slight Middle Eastern accent, asked, "Are you the patient's husband?" I noticed he didn't refer to me as the victim's husband. Terry patted my back and excused himself. "I'm Dr. Nadal," the doctor introduced himself. "Your wife has no visible injuries, though there are some tears in her rectum that won't require surgery and should heal quickly. She also has bite marks, often referred to as hickeys, on her breasts, but they don't need treatment." My stomach twisted as nausea overwhelmed me, picturing Elaine being violated like this. The doctor continued, "We performed a sexual assault exam and found semen in both her vagina and anus, as well as dried semen in her hair, indicating recent sexual activity. We've drawn blood to test for drugs, but the results aren't back yet. For now, that's all I can share with you or the detectives." His clinical tone irritated me, especially the way he described it as sexual activity rather than an assault. Sexual encounter didn't fit the horror I knew Elaine had gone through. Your wife refused to answer any questions except to say that she believes she was drugged and insists on speaking only with you. I don't see any reason to admit her to the hospital. The doctor said, but I'll wait for the blood work results before releasing her. She's had a mild sedative to calm her down, but she's awake now. You can go see her. Any questions, Mr. Sullivan? I shook my head, signaling no. All right, if anything comes up, feel free to have me paged. The results should be back in about an hour, and I'll consult with you then. Without offering any words of sympathy, he turned and left. I started toward the cubicles, but a stern-looking female detective, short and serious, stepped in front of me, blocking my path. My first instinct was to push past her, but before I could, she spoke firmly, I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan, but my partner and I need to speak with your wife first. This is a criminal investigation, and we need her statement. I glanced at Harvey, who was walking up behind her, clearly frustrated. Let it go, Anderson, he said firmly. Joe can see his wife for a few minutes, and then we'll conduct the interview. Her face flushed with anger as she shot back, Harvey, you know the rules. Letting the husband in first risks influencing her statement, which could be used later in court. I later learned her name was Sandra Anderson, a 27-year-old rookie detective with less than 5 years on the job. She had some powerful connections. Her uncle was the deputy mayor. Harvey, unimpressed, replied sarcastically, Listen, Anderson, I was making felony arrests before you were born. As the lead detective, I'm calling the shots. Joe Sullivan is a colleague, retired or not, and he deserves some professional courtesy. If that bothers you, feel free to wait in the car or the cafeteria. If you want to report me, go ahead. I'm looking for a reason to retire anyway. Anderson stormed off, her face bright red. Once she was out of earshot, Harvey muttered under his breath, "Goddamned affirmative action." She couldn't catch a cheat at a poker table. He turned to me and said, "Go ahead, Joe. I'll give you 15 minutes while I finish some paperwork." When I pulled back the curtain to Elaine's cubicle, she turned her head toward me. The moment she saw it was me, she turned away, her body shaking as she sobbed. I pulled up a chair and sat quietly, waiting for her to pull herself together. Although I felt bad seeing her in such distress, I couldn't deny that my anger still overshadowed any sympathy I had. I couldn't bring myself to look at Joe when he walked in, so I turned away and began crying. I had longed for him to be here, but now I didn't know what to say. How could I apologize for ignoring his warnings and ending up being used by someone who turned out to be a predator? In the clear light of day, I understood that regardless of my intentions, I had gone out for dinner and dancing with a man who wasn't my husband. As I lay there, I kept thinking about how I would have reacted if Joe had been in my shoes. What if he had told me he was going out with Andy, only for Andy to turn out to be Andrea, a younger, attractive woman? Joe's voice broke through my dark thoughts. "Elaine," he said. "The detectives will be in here soon to take your statement, so be prepared. Some of their questions will be personal and invasive. If you're saying that what happened occurred because you were incapacitated by pills or alcohol, you need to be honest. I should warn you, if you try to deceive them, they'll know." The lead detective has over 30 years of experience. He'll see right through any lies. His cold, detached tone stunned me. The only words that stood out in my mind were claim and deception. He hadn't even tried to comfort me, no warmth, no kindness. He sounded more like a lawyer than my husband. Through my tears, I felt anger rising. Finally, I turned to him and snapped, "Joe, it sounds like you don't believe me. I didn't talk to anyone until you got here because you've known me for over 20 years. You know what I did was stupid, but I never meant to have sex with anyone, let alone be assaulted by someone I trusted and considered a friend. Damn it, Joe, I wasn't seduced. I was drugged and violated. But I guess you don't see it that way, so why don't you just leave and go hang out with your cop buddies?" I turned away again, too furious to cry any longer. I heard his chair scrape against the floor, and moments later, the privacy curtain opened and closed. I knew he was gone, probably for good. When I returned to the waiting room, Harvey glanced up with a questioning look. His irritated partner sat across the room, arms crossed, looking sullen. "Thanks, Harvey, I said sincerely, realizing the risk he had taken for me. You can go in now, he replied, nodding. For the record, I think she's telling the truth. I pushed her buttons on purpose, and I believe her. He motioned to his partner, who reluctantly followed him into Elaine's cubicle. About 45 minutes later, neither Harvey nor his partner had come back out. That's when I noticed Dr. Nadal scanning the room. He spotted me and gestured for me to follow him into a small exam room down the hall. Once we were seated, his tone was noticeably softer than before. The lab results are in, he said. They show significant amounts of rohypnol and ketamine in her system. As you're aware from your time as an officer, these are commonly known as date rape drugs. When combined, they lower inhibitions, increase sexual desire, and impair communication between the brain and muscles, making resistance nearly impossible. I've shared the results with the detectives and provided them with a copy of the analysis. I've also started an 4 to help clear her system, and she should be able to leave in about 3 hours. He stood and extended his hand, adding, I'm truly sorry for what you and your wife are going through. Given the circumstances, I believe time and perhaps counseling will help you both recover. As he turned to leave, I stood up and asked, Doctor, may I ask you a few more questions? Though he looked a bit uncomfortable, realizing he had considered his duty finished, he nodded, likely anticipating what I was about to ask. I understand about the drugs and their effects, I began, but what I really need to know is, do those drugs prevent someone from feeling sexual pleasure? He sighed, motioning for me to sit as he did the same in a calm but measured tone. He replied, Mr. Sullivan, I can't give you a definitive answer. However, when the body's sexual organs are stimulated, it's possible for the body to respond even if the brain doesn't fully comprehend what's happening. The reaction is purely physical, without any emotional or voluntary control. Then, as if addressing the question weighing on my mind, he added, yes, it's possible your wife experienced a climax. Even victims of rape, whether drugged or not, sometimes report reaching orgasm. It often adds to their trauma as they feel betrayed by their own body for finding physical pleasure in something unwanted. Whether drugged or forced, the body's response is still involuntary, much like a reflex to pain. He gave my shoulder a comforting pat, stood, and left, likely relieved that I had no further questions to ask. I hadn't noticed that Harvey and his partner were standing near the entrance to the treatment area, apparently waiting for the doctor to leave. As Harvey approached, his partner, looking slightly less hostile, stayed back, allowing him to take the lead. Harvey started, Joe, you've got 20 years of police work under your belt, so I won't insult your intelligence by explaining the procedures first. I'm really sorry for both you and your wife, Harvey began. Based on her statement and the lab report, I'm confident she was drugged and, given her inability to consent, she was assaulted. The dirtbag likely spiked her drink when she went to the restroom. She had no idea what was happening and doesn't remember much of the attack. He paused then added, now comes the hard part. Harvey sighed before continuing, I hate to say this, Joe, and if I were telling this to anyone else, it would be a huge breach of protocol. But for your family's sake, especially your wife's, I wouldn't advise pursuing charges against this guy. I started to protest, but Harvey cut me off. Hear me out, Joe. No matter what you decide, I'll support you. But you know better than anyone how flawed our legal system is. If this scumbag gets a decent lawyer, the first thing they'll point out is that your wife willingly went on what looks like a date with him. Yeah, I know she caught you off guard and has explained everything. But to a jury, the fact that she had dinner, drinks, and danced with him doesn't look good. As for the drugs, they'll argue she took them herself to lower her inhibitions. Harvey continued. There's case law on this, Joe, both here and nationwide. Some women have even taken these drugs voluntarily. They'll claim she panicked when she realized how much time had passed and made up a story to protect her marriage. You know how ruthless defense attorneys can be. They'll drag both of you through the mud, and the media will paint you as an overpermissive husband and her as a cheating wife. Your son might face bullying from his peers, and in the end, this guy could still walk free. Harvey softened his voice. Joe, talk to your wife. Ultimately, it's her decision, but I need to know what you want to do before I leave. I can write this up as an unfortunate situation where your wife was misled, and the report will stay buried. After 30 years, I've earned enough favors from the department and the DA that you won't have to worry about charges or a false report. At first, I was hysterical when they suggested my attacker might go free. I screamed, no one believes me. Not the doctor, not the cops, and not even my husband, Joe. He tried to hold my hand, but I yanked it away and started sobbing uncontrollably. This time, however, he held on and refused to let go. Elaine, everyone believes you, Joe said gently. Everyone. This isn't about whether or not we believe you. It's about facing a painful reality. It's not about letting that creep off the hook. It's about sparing you the humiliation of a public trial. The trial wouldn't just take place in the courtroom but in the local media as well. If we had even a 50-50 chance of winning, I'd say go for it. But honestly, it's not even close. In the end, I reluctantly agreed. I think I did it more to protect Tommy from the embarrassment than for myself. As promised, Harvey buried the report, and we never heard from the DA. Unfortunately, not all stories end happily, and ours was one of those. The counseling sessions were emotionally exhausting for both of us, especially when Elaine described the one moment she remembered clearly. She told me how, during the assault, when she opened her eyes at first, she thought it was me having sex with her. Even after realizing it wasn't, she was in the middle of a climax and let it continue. The therapist tried to explain her reaction by asking me, Joe, if you were in a similar situation and started to climax, do you think you could stop? I responded sarcastically, you mean would I pull out of her mouth or from down there or back there? I saw Elaine flinch at my crude comment, but after a pause, I answered more seriously, first of all, Doc, I wouldn't put myself in that situation, so the question doesn't apply. But hypothetically, yes, I'd stop. We tried hard to save our marriage over the next 8 months, but it felt like watching a snowman slowly melt until the head finally collapsed and shattered. Oddly enough, I had almost forgotten the physical aspect of the assault. What haunted me more was the image of her walking down the stairs, kissing him on the cheek, and the defiant look she gave me as he put his arm around her and led her out the door and, in hindsight, out of my life. Elaine later explained that she had been angry and kissed him just to spite me, to get under my skin. But the fact that she wanted to hurt me like that was something I couldn't get over. The disrespect, the betrayal, and the lying were the real killers of our marriage. I had warned her about the possible consequences, but she chose to ignore me. She made her bed, and I refused to sleep in it. She'd have to lie in it alone. It's been 2 years since our tearful divorce. I gave Elaine the house until Tommy turns 18 or graduates from college, though I'll probably give it to her permanently in the end. I have my pension and a successful business, and she received a $250,000 settlement from the company, even though they denied any wrongdoing. Elaine did achieve a small victory against Conrad Hunter. Although we were advised that a civil suit likely wouldn't succeed, our attorney submitted our notarized statements and the toxicology report. Predictably, Conrad denied everything, but it turned out that 2 other sexual misconduct complaints against him from his previous office had been overlooked, either intentionally or not. One female employee accused him of groping her in the break room, and another married woman who requested a transfer claimed he offered to approve the move in exchange for sexual favors. Neither complaint had been substantiated, and Elaine's case fell into the same he said, she said category. But the company, tired of the potential legal risks, terminated him without cause. Not only did he lose his promotion to London, but he was let go without a letter of recommendation. After 12 years, the company gave Elaine the settlement money to avoid public embarrassment and a costly lawsuit. We both regretted that our marriage couldn't be saved, but we also recognized the futility of continuing a charade that was hurting our son. As far as I know, neither of us dated for over a year. Recently, though, Elaine has been seeing someone regularly. He's a few years younger than her and lost his wife at a young age. He seems like a decent guy, and on the rare occasions we cross paths, he's always polite. At first, I was polite but distant toward him, though my jealousy has lessened over time. Now, I genuinely wish her well. My softening attitude probably has a lot to do with the woman I've been seeing. She was one of my clients for several home improvement projects and finalized her divorce over a year ago after her abusive, alcoholic husband put her in the hospital with a concussion and a fractured collarbone. Her 14-year-old son Kevin and I have grown close, and I've included him in several of our outings. Tommy and Alicia's son get along well, and though my relationship with Alicia has grown closer, we've kept our own places for now. It's partly for the sake of appearances with the kids and partly because we're both a bit hesitant about diving into marriage again. Now here's something I've never told anyone. While Elaine got her justice with the settlement, mine came in a different way. During my years as a cop, I encountered all sorts of people, the good, the bad, and the truly terrible. One of the latter was Mario, an Irish mob enforcer. I'd arrested him 3 times for assault, but he always managed to get off. 3 months after the incident with my wife, I ran into Mario again. He greeted me like an old friend, and we talked casually about life. 5 days later, he called me, asking to meet at a local bar. After a few drinks, he led me to his car and said, "I've got something for you." He popped open the trunk, revealing a small bag. Inside was a jar, the type used in biology labs. Mario shone his phone's flashlight on it, and I saw what looked like a man's genitals, testicles and all. Grinning, he said, "Your wife's attacker won't be showing off to any women again. Don't worry, he's alive, just not quite the man he used to be." I was speechless. I shook Mario's hand and went home. Sometimes life hands you unexpected gifts. 2 years after our divorce, Elaine and I have managed to move forward. The pain and bitterness that once defined our relationship have mostly faded, though the scars remain constant reminders of what we lost. We tried hard to save what we had, but some things, like trust, can never be fully restored once broken. We shared 19 years together, raised a son, and made countless memories. But the betrayal, whether or not it was intentional, was too deep to overcome. Elaine's life has taken a different direction. She's been seeing someone new for a while now, a younger man who was widowed years ago. From what I can tell, he's a decent guy. Though it stung at first to see her moving on, I've learned to let go of my jealousy. Whenever we cross paths, he's always respectful toward me, and I've even wished them well despite everything. Elaine deserves happiness, and I've come to accept that her future no longer includes me. She's not the same woman who left that night, and I'm no longer the man who watched her walk out the door. As for me, I found someone, Alicia. We met when I was doing some contracting work for her after her difficult divorce. Her ex-husband was abusive, and his violent behavior left her wary of relationships. But over time, we've built something solid. We've taken things slow, partly out of caution and partly out of respect for our kids. Her son Kevin and Tommy have become close friends, bonding through our weekend outings. My relationship with Alicia has its challenges, but it feels different, healthier, more honest. Though we've kept separate homes for now, we're slowly moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful about the future. In the aftermath of everything, Elaine and I managed to handle things maturely for Tommy's sake. He's a bright, resilient kid, and watching him grow and navigate through this tough time has been a source of pride for both of us. He didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of our mistakes, and if nothing else, I'm grateful we kept his well-being as our top priority. Elaine got the house, and when Tommy turns 18, it'll likely stay hers. I've done well enough in my business to provide for myself and for Tommy, and I don't resent her for keeping the house. She's been through a lot. Elaine found some closure with the settlement, though I initially struggled with the fact that Conrad walked away without facing criminal charges. Still, I found my own form of closure in an unexpected way. What Mario did, what he gave me, wasn't the kind of justice I'd imagined, but it felt like justice all the same. That man will never hurt anyone again. While I don't condone violence, part of me is grateful that someone took action when I couldn't. In the end, life goes on. The anger, the resentment, and the heartbreak, all of it has slowly been washed away by time. While part of me will always look back on those 19 years with regret, another part of me remembers the good times. Elaine wasn't just my wife, she was my best friend. For most of those years, we were a team. But sometimes, even the strongest bonds can crack under the weight of life's challenges. And when they do, you're left to rebuild from scratch. I've rebuilt, and I'm still rebuilding. Elaine has too. Our marriage ended, but life didn't. I don't know what the future holds for either of us, but I do know that we're both stronger now in our own ways. We've learned from our mistakes, and we've moved on. Life has a way of surprising you, and while I didn't expect to end up on this path, I'm learning to embrace it one day at a time.